we've got Jen Silverman, an American playwright, TV writer, novelist, and you can read her full bio on the site. And we've got Zak Salih. He is currently in DC, and his fiction and nonfiction has appeared in numerous publications. Both of these authors have first-time novels out on the racks right now. And I'm wondering whether or not you guys gave any thought to the name of our session, if it was maybe a nod to the Nirvana song.
Oh, I didn't.
Oh.
I wow, I thought about that song in a while. I mean, yeah. I can't speak for Jen, but I can certainly speak for myself in terms of the characters in my book are operating on very kind of emotional extremes, and they're certainly not shy about it. So, and obviously there's something inherently queer about the idea of just coming as you are and not as what you want other people to perceive you as being.
Right. I think the converse of that are the characters in my book who are sort of caught up in these performances of who they feel like they should be. And part of the journey of the book is figuring out how to come as you are, essentially.
Yeah. Just to remind us all, the lyrics, the pounding lyrics were come as you are, as you were, as I want you to be, as a friend, as an old enemy. Take your time, hurry up. Choice is yours. Don't be late. Take a rest as a friend, as an old memoria. So with that, I think we should dive right on in. I am going to ask you guys if you're willing to play a little game. Yeah?
Okay.
I need some head nods. Zak, don't be afraid.
Yes.
Six-word story. Six-word story to describe your book. I'll give you a minute.
We play ourselves and we fail, I think would be mine.
Say that again.
We play ourselves and we fail.
Oh, Jen, that's good, man.
That is good.
I just the title helps, it's almost like a sentence.
I'll come back to you, Zak. I didn't mean to throw you off.
No, I'm sorry to disappoint. This is why I write and I don't speak. I can't come up with this answer without like 20 drafts.
All good.
How about For Gay Men Then and Now?
Oh,
there we go.
Nice. Because one of the things that I don't want to do today is give away all of the good stuff about either of your books. So when somebody asked me, hey, what books are you reading for the book festival this year? I was like, mind blowing, right? And so I said, well, one of them is, and I gave them these clues. I said, Latin, art, life, glitter. Guess which book that was. And then film, friendship, professional, private. And those were the ways that I described both of your books. And so, so then of course we got into, let's get back to the party and, the things that we could talk about with regard to the different characters. But the first question I have for you is, how did it feel to be listed on the Oprah's list of LGBTQ books that will change the literary landscape in 2021?
I mean, it's always lovely to be recognized by an icon like that. It's certainly I can't speak for Jen, but for me it's daunting to think of one particular book somehow changing a literary landscape. That's a tall order, and I think if someone had told me that that's what I was doing, I wouldn't have had the courage to write a single word. It's lovely to be recognized, and for me it was lovelier to just be included among so many other books, some of them by authors that I have read and that I revere. So just to be in that company, I know that's a stock answer, but it's the truth. Just to be in that company was something special.
And
Nice.
also seeing
How about
the
you,
other
Jen?
books on that list. Oh, I think there's a little bit of delay on my end. Let me know if that continues. But seeing the other books on that list made me really excited about what that landscape could be, you know, because if those are the books that are sort of participating in creating or changing a landscape, I mean, the ones that I didn't know I wrote down to go buy, but the ones that I did know, I thought like that's a nuanced and interesting landscape to, you know, just sort of be involved in. So that it made me really excited.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's true, because I think historically queer stories have been told in a certain way. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And that's another thing about the landscape in that article is those stories are so diverse, and the characters seem so interesting. And one of the things that I particularly enjoy is having unsavory queer characters. I think that is just as important in some ways as kind of the traditional kind of, you know, very kind of assured, very positive, and very important representation of queer lives in literature. But I hope that kind of as we progress, you know, artists will not be shy about, you know, writing about queer people as messy and hypocritical and you know, even villainous. I mean, queer people are just as perfectly capable of blowing up the world as heteronormative people. And you know, that all that complexity just also all goes back to just the idea of being human, right? And Carmen Maria Machado has this beautiful thing where she's talking about queer villainy in her memoir In the Dream House, and you know, and she talks about all these ways that we're kind of not supposed to present ourselves as queer people, and she writes it so much more succinctly and beautifully than I can say now. But her basic argument is, look, like we're messy and we do all these bad things because we're just like you, which is what we've been trying to tell you all along.
Yeah. So Jen, what's your take on how queer stories have historically been portrayed, and what inspired you to write yours?
I mean, I think for me, I didn't think about We Play Ourselves necessarily as a queer story when I was writing it. And of course, almost all of the characters in it are queer, you know, but in writing it, I was thinking about, and I think this is maybe a testament to sort of where we are in terms of the literary landscape right now and how much has changed, but I was thinking about it as a story of ambition and failure and success and grappling with our friendships and our intimacies, and none of the characters are sort of like coming out. None of the characters, none of their problems really are rooted in their queerness, you know. The queerness is just part of their sort of the landscape of their identity. So in some ways, maybe like for me, that feels like the ultimate queer engagement, in that it's about so much else that is feeding into their identities. But yeah, I'm not sure if that's answering your question. I think that sometimes traditionally queer stories, the only conflict on the table is that you're queer and you are being perceived or misperceived by the straight world. And a lot of the queer books that I've really loved are unconcerned by how they're being perceived or misperceived by the straight world. That's not really what it's about anymore in some ways.
Yeah, I appreciate that, because when I was reading it, as I mentioned to you, there was so much complexity to some of the plot lines that I was really, you know, transfixed by it all. It didn't appear that that was the message, that they were queer, that these were just complex people with very interesting lives, that they were just trying to figure out themselves, and that the fact that they were queer was just another part of their identity. So I appreciate that. Zach, there was a line in your book that I loved the response that character made. So I want to ask you what you were thinking when you wrote it. And that was, they were in the bar, and one of the girls leans over and says very loudly, "I love my gays." You remember that?
Oh, yeah.
So what was going through your mind when you responded the way you did through the character?
What was going through my mind was this kind of this complaints that I have heard about who gets to occupy these queer spaces, and why, and for what means, and in terms of speaking about gay male spaces, I mean, the kind of traditional argument is heteronormative women having bachelorette parties in gay bars, right? And thinking that they are in this environment where they can where gay men are suddenly fetishized in a way that's not sexual at all, but that's just about a kind of perception of safety, right? Like for lack of better words, just this room full of docile men. And so with the character Oscar, who has this very awkward, or at least it was awkward for me to write, this kind of very kind of angry, direct confrontation with one of these women at a gay beach bar in Delaware. I kind of wanted to give expression, albeit a certain kind of heightened and exaggerated expression of what it would be like if someone then turned around and actually articulated why they didn't think that a heteronormative woman belonged in this space. And it's up to the reader to determine whether it's right or wrong. And for me, this kind of in a larger frame, it kind of suggests this kind of complexity and this kind of back and forth between equality and obscurity, right? Like if we're all equal and we should all be in these spaces, then suddenly being gay or being in a gay bar kind of loses its character, or its identity is challenged by the existence of people who are not gay being in those spaces. That was what was going on in my mind when I wrote that uncomfortable scene.
Yeah, I could literally hear it in my head. I could hear that woman saying that, and I have probably witnessed that several times. So I appreciate your perspective and how it was framed. And you bring up something that I also found in Jen's book, which was this unabashed sense of right to feel a range of emotions, particularly, Jen, this idea of rage. So I was wondering if you could kind of walk me through it, because that was some new territory for a lot of the books that I've seen come out in terms of framing women's perspective on rage.
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple conversations about rage in We Play Ourselves, but the one that our main character Cass, sort of finds herself transfixed by is the difference between her experience. She's in her mid-30s, and her experience of rage, which is, women in my generation, and I think the generations above, are really socialized out of their anger, that you aren't supposed to take up space with your anger. You're supposed to facilitate things for other people. You're supposed to not ever be inconvenient. It's sort of incumbent on you, if you are angry, to swallow your anger, and make space for somebody else's. And would I have, not to make blanket statements that, obviously, like, it's complicated, but what I have noticed in the generation below mine, and in students that I work with, is that there is a different sort of emotional vocabulary that young women have, and a different sense of entitlement to their anger. They wear it very differently. They can articulate it in ways that I was never socialized to be able to articulate, and so in the book, Cass is someone who has repressed her anger, and then it blows up, which leads, I won't, no spoilers, but it leads to this sort of scandal that becomes her, like, the central event of her downfall is this scandal that we learn about early on, and it takes a while to learn what it is. But some of that is tied to the ways that she has not learned to appropriately own and inhabit her anger. And she finds herself early in the book encountering this young female fight club, where these girls have sort of repurposed, of course, the classic Fight Club, and the exercise of their rage is there's so much agency in it that she is kind of transfixed by it. And when I see younger women, with this sort of emotional vocabulary, I also am transfixed by it. I think it's it's kind of remarkable.
Yeah. Yeah, that was, I could also visualize all of those scenes very vividly because of the way that you described each of these girls. So I'll have a follow-up question for you about that as a playwright and a potential filmmaker. Zach, I would love for you to dive a little bit deeper into the complexities of all of the different friendships and relationships. When we were talking about addressing emotions, I think
Yeah.
Sebastian had some things to work out, wouldn't you say?
I don't know what you're talking about.
I
They're
know,
all
right?
they're all very stable characters. Yeah, I mean, so there is a line early on in the book where a character describes his own friendship with someone and how they would write letters back and forth to one another, and they would address themselves as the sad queen and the angry queen. And so, like I said earlier, I wrote this book intending for these two characters, Oscar and Sebastian, who are these estranged childhood friends who meet up at a gay wedding, and all sorts of existential angst ensues from that encounter. There were so many different relationships, and it's not about just the relationship between the two of them. It's about their relationship in terms of kind of the past and the future of gay male culture, and also by extension queer culture as well. And their kind of story was really kind of a way for me to fictionalize my own kind of experience as being part of this kind of in-between generation of gay men who has no lived experience of the AIDS plague, right? Like to me it is history. I have no personal connection. I wasn't conscious of myself as a gay person then. I have no experience of what it's like to lose friends and lovers in that way. I mean, everything I know about that experience is told to me through literature and through documentary film. So there's that, but then there's also this other side of the equation, right, where we live now, and I certainly don't want to suggest that it's a rosy picture, but I think it's inarguable that we live in a time of increased visibility for queer people and for queer culture, and that's something that we see reflected in youth, right? And that's also another experience I didn't have, right? There were no, homosexuality wasn't something you really talked about in health class. So just what is it like to kind of be strung in between these two very, very different experiences, and what does that do to someone's relationship to their peers and to the people who come before and after them?
Yeah, I love how each of your books sort of had that wise person, right? That wise person character. And for Jen, Helene was very interesting to me. Like, I loved the way that you fashioned her wisdom about the world and about how gentle and delicate she was with Cass. And so I'm just wondering, what was the inspiration for having someone who was wise and an elder, so to speak, in that particular situation?
A few things. I mean, theater in of itself is very intergenerational, right? You have like the young artists coming up, and then the artists who've sort of been there and are working deeper in their craft, and then sort of the elder statesmen that inherited a landscape that they have changed. And I wanted a character who, Helene is in her mid-50s, and so she has made a career for herself as a theater director at a time when there were very few, female theater directors who commanded the power and the respect, who had access to the opportunities that the men did. Even now, and things have changed, but they haven't fully changed. But it felt important to have a character who had succeeded in a way, and that she has forged this career. She has created the life that she wanted, but she is someone who has managed to do that by being very pragmatic about the compromises that she'll make and being very pragmatic about the landscape in which she is operating. And she says to Cass early on, like, you know, there's the world that you want to live in and you are acting as if, but that is not the world you're actually living in, you know? And so if you want the things that you say that you want, you have to, and in Helen's case, she's saying, like, to Cass, don't talk about being queer, don't talk about being a woman, like, don't let people ask you questions about your sexuality and your relationships, because that makes you sort of a salacious niche entertainer as opposed to a serious artist. And Cass is saying, well, why can't I be a queer woman and be a serious artist? Like, those things don't have to be contradictory. And so in these sort of intergenerational conversations, there is the pull between the way things were and how you adapt to the way things were, and the way you hope things someday will be, but you haven't gotten there yet. And, you know, Cass says, well, how do you get there if you aren't driving the bus in that direction? And Helen says, you want what you want, maybe you shouldn't be the one driving the bus. So it, you know, it's complicated, and those complexities really interest me. And in Zak's book also, I loved the relationships between the younger gay man and the older gay male writer who just had a different perspective on relationships and loss and compromise.
Thanks, Jen. Oh, I was just going to say, speaking of Helen, the one comment that she makes, and I apologize for not saying it exactly the way that you wrote it, but she tells Kath at one point that there are so many kinds of intimacies in the world, yep, and it's so easy to get them confused. And I read that line and I thought, wow, like that's exactly what I was trying to drive at in my book. But you said it so much more succinctly and beautifully. And I loved that character. And I love that piece of advice, both that she gives the character and just as something to apply to just everyday life in general.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was really beautifully written. And but Zak, I really kind of wanted to hear your perspective of how you developed the character of Sean, because in my mind, I saw him as this bigger than life Papa Bear kind of individual. And I'm just wondering, was it a myth or was it a man?
Yeah, well, I feel like, Jeanette, what the question you're really trying to ask me, which is what a lot of people have asked me, is that based on any particular gay male writer? And you know, I can't be responsible for whether people believe me or not, but I will say no, it's not, for this express reason that I don't know any gay male writers well enough to be able to write a kind of character. So the character of Sean was honestly cobbled together, I think, the way most writers cobble together things, which is from their everyday life. Like, there are parts of him that are friends of mine. Like, he has the voice of a friend of mine, or at least the way that I visualized him in my head is kind of a Frankenstein mishmash of different people. But yeah, he is, to borrow Jen's words, a kind of elder statesman, and whose books are these very kind of, you know, salacious kind of basically ethnographic studies of a kind of radical, highly sexualized queer life in the 70s, and that kind of pre-AIDS experience that the character of Oscar really kind of, in his own kind of ignorance, idealizes, without really understanding or contextualizing that with everything that came after, right? So there's this massive tome that the character Sean writes, where he's basically cataloging all the people that he lost to the AIDS plague, and at one point Oscar tells him, I have no interest in it. There's too much death and there's not enough sex, you know, so I wanted that in there. And parts of that too is, I mean, that's how I was introduced, at least in the very early stages, to you know, to not just gay literature, but to gay sex. I mean, I would go to the library and I would try and track down books, and you know, and I wasn't reading them for the joy of language or sentence structure. That was the farthest thing from my mind. And so the kind of the relationship between Oscar and Sean is for me kind of just an homage of you know, how how literature kind of transports us, but is not always giving us the complete story. And it's really, it's not enough to read the text, but it's about taking the text and contextualizing it in kind of a lived experience. If that makes sense.
It does. I do want to ask a quick question, and because you both are such amazing writers, you start off your book, Zak, with, let me get back to it, a quote. And it really, it spoke to me about, what are we, how one becomes what one is, right? With Nietzsche and Ecce Homo. So, and this was written, as we know, a few weeks before he went mad, but that's how you introduce us to the characters. And I was just curious as to why you use that as an anchor for the first chapter.
Well, so there's, Ecce Homo, obviously behold the man, but, of course, here are the homos. Like here's the kind of blanket, state of gay men circa the summer of 2015 when this story begins, which is a totally radically different world than the world that Sean occupied when he first wrote that kind of first book of his that's being reissued now, all these decades later. It was a fun pun. I'm sure I'm not the first person to think of it, but I thought I can't let that go.
Yeah, no, it didn't go unnoticed, but I was like, I know that there was a reason why he anchored us there. So Jen, we were talking about how one finds out about who they are, right? And so your characters, I got a sense that they needed to be seen, that they needed to find their place in the world and understand how others viewed them, perhaps. So I'm just wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about how your characters tell the story about the roles that they assumed.
Yeah. I think our protagonist, Cass, is someone who is desperate to be visible. She feels like she exists when she sees herself through other people's eyes. And in the wake of, and we meet her in the first chapter, in the wake of this sort of very public and humiliating scandal, I think she begins the book in a place of, if everybody looks at me and they see a failure and they see a laughingstock, that must be who I am. And so as a failure and a laughingstock, how do I achieve a comeback? Which for her, that means, how do I make people look at me with respect again, with, admiration. And her journey throughout the book really is tied to how she sees the people around her seeing herself, and then eventually what she sees when nobody else is looking at her, for better or worse. And I think some of the other characters in the book, they struggle with perception in different ways. When she moves to LA, she's staying with a very close college friend of hers, who's at the end of his 7-year relationship with his boyfriend, in part because his boyfriend, who's Australian, is moving back to Australia and has never come out to his family there. So the family thinks that, that he's been living with a roommate for 7 years, and that he has a girlfriend, and that, like, this entire construction. I think a lot of the characters are living double lives in terms of the life that they perform depending who's in front of them, and then the ways in which they're interrogating who it is that's doing the performance when they're by themselves.
Yeah, I really thought it was clever how, you played a scene that a lot of us have had to play or unwittingly have played, and that is, can you just come with me to my parents' house for the weekend? And then you get like, wait a second, something you didn't tell me, right? And so I thought that was really clever, how you brought that into the conversation between her and the two roommates situation. So I liked the contemporary feel of the book. And both of your books were really very contemporary. Zak, you've mentioned that you had a nod to the Pulse tragedy. So I'm wondering what inspired you to put that sense of loss in your book?
Well, so I wanted to write something that was adjacent to the present moment.
Mhm.
And I think for me, there was a sudden, very frightening symmetry to the fact that the Obergefell v. Hodges ruling and the Pulse nightclub shooting are almost exactly a year apart. And the kind of journey from this moment of very kind of public joy to this moment of very public trauma, and for me personally, two moments that I can say that I absolutely experienced as someone, as a gay man, as someone who was conscious of his own identity, his own queerness. It just seemed like it seemed to me, I don't want to say like, oh, it was just a fantastic idea, but it seemed fitting to kind of ground these two characters' personal journeys in the kind of larger historical context of that year. And I suppose that a lot of that is, I'm just very fascinated by, the kind of subtle links between individual lives and kind of larger, cultural movements and cultural stories. And yeah.
I really, when I got to that part, it threw me back, right? It's like, oh yeah, I remember that, and it brought all of that emotion that went along with it. I would love to explore a little bit about this idea that the contemporary setting of each of your books was in big cities, right? DC, LA, New York, but there was a common thread between the two books and the stories with regard to the relationship that your characters had, not just to the big city, but also to their small hometown. So, Jen, would you like to share some insight on how that storyline developed?
Yeah, well, I'll say that when I was reading Zak's book and again, no spoilers, but I got to the moment where the characters again in sort of, Sebastian is back with his father out of the big city. I felt such recognition of those feelings and of that. I thought it was such a beautiful section. And also it felt like it was in direct conversation with my book, where eventually at a certain point, Cass, the main character, goes back home to her hometown and she's sleeping in her childhood bedroom. For me, it's yet another performance that Cass starts to interrogate, where she has been the successful playwright, and then she's been the failure and the laughing stock, and then of course there is the family member performance where you're not even aware of performing, but you are forever perceived by your family in a certain role as a certain person, the person who would do XYZ. They just know you so well, in terms of how you were molded. And I think in Cass having to renegotiate her relationship with where she came from and with her family, she finds a measure of peace that she didn't expect to find. And I became really interested in what happens when you really fall to the bottom of the well, right? You would think like, and then having to give up your life in the city and sleeping in your childhood bedroom would be sort of like the greatest disgrace in some ways, if you are somebody who is trying to clamber a ladder in the opposite direction. But that in that kind of return to her roots, there are still discoveries for Cass to make. It isn't, she is not the person that she expects herself to be. And actually her parents are more complicated and they have more to offer her than she expected them to have, that she sort of felt fear that she would receive from them judgment for failing as well. And instead there is a kind of understanding that they have from their vantage point of, life is long, and failure and success are such limited words for these journeys that we go on. Yeah.
I have to tell you, Jen, that was like one of the most satisfying parts of the book. So thank you for that. Hey, Zak, what about you? What was the relationship between and the storyline between this big city life and then this small town home base?
Yeah, I mean, city-wise, I mean, speaking of just DC, it's what I know. I feel like, speaking very generally in terms of the kind of wealth of literature out there, at least, you know, when I was again first kind of reading, you know, gay literature and queer literature, it seemed like queer people only existed in San Francisco and New York. So there was a small part of me that was like, oh, like, look, we're here in DC too. Like, we're all over the place. So part of the reason for setting it in DC was that familiarity, and I think part of it too was just, hey, look, like here's a gay storyline, set in DC, in which kind of, New York is just this very kind of distant, experience for both of the characters. There's something just incredibly potent and powerful, and I think Jen's book solidifies this, about the idea of returning home and returning to your roots after the world has just beaten and battered you down. And unfortunately, in my novel, I think that return is a little complicated, or at least a little anticlimactic, especially in the case of Oscar. I won't say exactly why he returns home, but he has to eventually. And he likens it to, it's this place in small town Ohio that he was taken to by his parents as a young boy, and kind of disrupted his childhood friendship with Oscar. It's a place where he was bullied. It's a place that he doesn't want to talk about, that he doesn't want to remember. But he has to go back, and he likens it at one point to the bullies kind of, suspending spit over his face and then slurping it back up into their mouths. That to him is the idea of returning home. So there's nothing very pleasurable about it. And I think one of the kind of faults of Oscar is he kind of overlooks or doesn't know how to interpret these important moments that could teach him lessons, right? There are moments where he could very well reconcile with members of his family during that trip, and he doesn't, because I think one of his great faults is just a kind of ignorance of a larger history, but I think also personal history, and his relationship with his parents, and his relationship with his friend, and just kind of having this very cavalier attitude about the past that I'm very sympathetic with. I mean, I was very fortunate to not have the relationship with my parents that Oscar has, to have come out and to have been accepted. That's very fortunate. And so I wrote Oscar specifically to kind of explore what would I have been like if I had been in that situation. And I think I would have been absolutely full of resentment for my family, and I would not have wanted to have returned home. And if I had, I would have hated it, and I would have probably overlooked any opportunity for some kind of reconciliation, or just some kind of character defining moment. So in that regard, these kind of returns to one's roots, at least in the context of my book, are very kind of anticlimactic and disappointing, because of how the character kind of understands, or the lack of understanding they have.
Well, I appreciate that. I think for me, what I was really struck by was this idea that in both of your books, the characters portrayed themselves to others and to self very differently when they were in the big city and who they were in their small towns, right?
Yeah, no, for sure.
Yeah. So that was just something that really struck me. Speaking of going home and having that experience of being in a big city, I loved, again, I mentioned that I loved that you had a very contemporary setting to your stories, and I personally didn't grow up in a time where there were LGBT support groups in high school, or same-sex prom, or any of that, and so I'm just wondering, when you were growing up, what stories do you wish you had been able to read about your own identity journey?
I mean, I wish that there had been sort of kind of, or that I had been aware of the sort of queer literary landscape that exists right now. I went to a high school that I think was a public high school that was sort of torn between the liberal leanings of a number of teachers, and it also was fairly conservative in a lot of ways. And I remember, I don't remember if it was sophomore year or junior year, a group of my friends did what was called at the time, I don't know if people still do it, but a day of silence protest. So you wouldn't speak, and when you were called upon by teachers, or you know had to speak, you would hand out a piece of like a little card stock that would sort of explain that it was in solidarity with like a lot of the queer people who had been murdered and who were silenced and who da da da. And I think I don't remember who sort of organized it. But it was a small group of students doing it, and I was actually really surprised by the reaction to it, which was really negative for the most part. You know, and we were permitted to do it, you know, so that's also a vote on the side of like the progressives who I think were really angling for change. But the reaction was really, from what I recall, you know, not positive. And that I absorbed that, you know, I witnessed that. This is what happens when you raise your voice. You can do it, and there are people who will rally to you, but also a lot of people are not ready to have this conversation. And I think that, you know, if I had been aware of a body of literature portraying, you know, a varied queer experience at an earlier age, I think that could only have been a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I absolutely agree with what Jen said. It's not, to me, it wouldn't have been the kind of stories. I think it would have just been any story that had been validated by you know a middle schooler or high school teacher as like this is a text that we read, and like it is, you know, and the kind of books that would facilitate a kind of conversation about queerness. And you know, just to kind of have queer text be part of a curriculum, part of a high school curriculum, right? Something that, and there's something kind of normalizing about that, about, you know, kind of adding it to a curriculum that again, like Jen said, I just think it could only have done wonders for me and you know, for so many others, and instead of having to kind of go and do those furtive searches on your own.
Yeah, for sure. We're getting close to end of the session, but I do have a couple of other quick questions that I wanted to ask you with regard to the fact that you are both such prolific writers, and you've been published in many, many places. And I just kind of want to know, who do you read?
Who do I read? I mean, I read. I try. You know, I grew up around books. Both my parents are readers, so I try and read as voraciously as possible, to the point where sometimes I have anxiety and I feel guilty about rereading a book, because why would I reread a book even if I enjoyed it, when there's so many other books that I can go and read for the first time. If you had to ask me to just give a list, with the caveat being that these are names that are just circling in my head right now. I mean, oh God, I would say, Maggie Nelson, Garth Greenwell, Carmen Maria Machado. And I've been trying to reread some books by Philip Roth. There's a Sudanese writer, Tayeb Saleh, who's, you know, unfortunately no relation, and who just wrote these incredible books about kind of attacks against colonialism, but also very kind of like psychosexual novels, which to me, being half Sudanese, was just very kind of surprising. Like, wow, like, you know, you can write about sex and murder. This is great. Yeah, that's what is at the top of my head right now.
Yeah, I read
that. I'm curious.
A lot of novels, a lot of poetry. I'll add some plays to that list, though. Antoinette Nwandu is an amazing playwright that I read. Deepika Guha is another one. Basil Kremendall, Max Posner, Brandon Jacobs Jenkins, Young Jean Lee was seminal for me. David Adjmi also. I think people think that you should only encounter a play on the stage in production, but actually plays can be really amazing to read on the page. It's not a lesser experience, it's just a different experience. And sometimes, particularly with certain playwrights, you can feel really close to them and to their voice on the page, because the way that a play is even laid out is toward the way that they want you to hear it. So also a lot of plays.
I would have never thought to read a play, Jen. So thank you for that, because where do you find them? Like, how do I find them?
You can find plays. I mean, most collections are on Amazon, but let's not talk about Amazon. You can go to TCG and order collections of plays. You can go to Oprah Books, which is based out of the UK. Most
that's cool.
stores actually have sort of trade publications of plays, and then of course Concord Samuel French has, and Play Scripts have the acting editions of plays. So there's a lot of ways. Basically, if you just type in the name of a play or a playwright into Google, you will have multiple options for how to purchase that play.
I had no idea you could do that. Thank you for that. And Zak, I really wish I had been writing them all down. I took a few names down, but I'm always fascinated by what authors read. And so I think that was really helpful.
I'll email that to you after this.
Yeah, please do. I think that for me, the ever-changing nature of success and ambition and art was such an integral part of both your novels, and the characters are constantly changing roles in search of themselves and comparing themselves to others. And in such a subjective industry, I would love to ask you both, how do you stay grounded?
I mean, I'm still learning, I think, how to stay grounded, but I will say that working in a couple of different media has been really helpful for me. I write plays, I write books, I work in TV and film, and so having the ability to pivot from one mode of working and thinking into another really helpful in creating, a way of practicing art where you pick the projects you really love and you really care about and you commit to them and you don't think too much about all of the rest of the noise,
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. It absolutely is a daily challenge. In terms of, staying ground, I like to think that I've as one gets older, one cares less and less about the opinions of strangers. I know that's certainly kind of been my experience as a queer person and just as a human being. And I think that's why I could only, kind of embark on my writing career in the past few years, is because you're absolutely right. Like, writing is so subjective, and there are people who love your work, and there are people who hate your work, and there are people who will tell you to do this and tell you to do that. And one thing that's kind of kept me grounded is just kind of understanding that, when it comes to art, everything is so subjective that kind of the only sense of objectivity can have, whether they're a playwright or a painter or a musician, is really just kind of their own taste and instinct, and that's what one should really kind of drive for, and a lot of the rest of it is just really out of your control. It sounds so easy coming out of my mouth. It's I constantly have to remind myself. I don't want to give the impression that I have this kind of Zen attitude, but kind of thinking of that as like a refrain is certainly been beneficial to me.
Well, you give off that Zen attitude, Zak, so make no mistake about that.
It's the medication.
It's the medication. We do have a few questions I want to get to, but I heard a rumor that Zak, the preview of your next novel involves a giant naked man on an island. What's that about?
Oh, yeah. I was feeling very playful when I wrote that, and it is true, although it's only true in a certain sense. But I will leave it at that until the draft circulating. I will leave it at that. But technically, it's true. But I hope it's a little bit more than that.
I love it. So, Jen, I wish we had more time because I'm just fascinated by your journey in all the different genres of word. And I'm curious, as I was reading your book, I was like, I wonder who she would pick for this particular character or that particular character. So, with the success of this book, have you thoughts about pitching it to someone for any other medium, like a play or I don't know, Netflix?
I'm having some conversations right now. Yeah, I think I probably can't say too much more than that, but I'm having some.
Oh, that makes me so very happy because I think this would be an amazing visual presentation for sure. I appreciate that. So we're going to hop over to the questions here. And Zak, there is another Zak that's watching and listening. And he says, I read somewhere that you admire Garth Greenwell. I find both of his books incredibly lonely. What is it that you admire about his writing or depiction of LGBT life? And do you think those attributes you admire might shape your own future writing? Thanks for the question,
Wow.
Zak.
Well, first of all, great name. That's a really good question. I do believe that a lot of gay male writers now write in the shadow of Garth Greenwell, and what a warm and welcoming shadow it is. It's very nurturing. I guess to be kind of playful about it, I have a kink for queer melancholia. I find the idea of loneliness and nostalgia and these very kind of inward directed just kind of emotions to be I don't know, there's just something conducive about that and writing a short story and a novel, and that's absolutely something that I see as kind of a through line in the work that I've produced so far, although ultimately it's not up to me to make that kind of judgment. Yeah. And you kind of run the danger, right, of kind of romanticizing kind of queer loneliness and that kind of idea of is queer happiness possible? And of course it is. I mean, I like to think that I live it, and the people that I share my life with and that I surround myself with live it too. So having that, I feel I don't feel any kind of obligation as a writer to kind of present gay men in a certain way, and so I want to present them the way that I want to, which is kind of sad and lonely, and that says everything about my own kind of artistic impulses and nothing about an entire diverse community.
Nice. This question is from Alu and Jen. I think we might have touched a little bit on it, but she's asking, who are some favorite contemporary queer writers in any form, genre, that you feel are also changing the landscape and that you are excited about? Jen, you want to start us off?
Yeah, well, I'll repeat a couple of names in case you didn't catch them, but Brandon Jacobs Jenkins, an amazing playwright, queer playwright who is really pushing the bounds of the form, in my opinion. David Adjmi is another one, Basil Kremendall. Hannah Gamble is a poet whose work I really love. I think a queer Chicago-based poet. I'll mention her also. And then Zak mentioned earlier Maggie Nelson, who has been sort of a touchstone for me in terms of what a novel can be, what an essay can be, like Maggie seems to work between so many forms in a way that is really thrilling. So I'll add a check next to that name as well.
Nice.
Yeah.
I'm going to tell Clay we need to ask you guys to submit those kind of like recommended readers and writers, because I think that would make a fantastic list. Did you want to add a couple more to that, Zak?
Yeah, I mean, I'll definitely throw out some other names. I think poets like Jericho Brown, Richie Hoffman. I think of short stories by Peter Kispert. I think of that delightfully dark novel by Patrick Nathan, and I know he also has an essay collection coming out soon. And he's just an incredible writer and essayist. And then Kristen Arnett. I'm really looking forward to With Teeth. I really enjoyed Mostly Dead Things, and yeah, her work's incredible.
Nice. I think I'm going to need COVID isolation to last a little longer because my list just got incredibly long. Let's see if we got anything else. I love this question. Maricela asks, if you could write a version of yourself as a queer elder in a fictional near future setting, what would that life look like? Wow, that's a great question.
It would probably be kind of close to the life I live now. I'm a sweatpants at 8 o'clock on a Saturday night gay, and I'm damn proud of it.
Nice.
And the fact that is exactly the kind of future queer elder I would be, preferably with a baggy cardigans.
Nice.
Yeah, I like this near future setting. I want to be like space station queer in a place with an oxygen tank. I mean, we could go anywhere with this. I'm interested.
I love that. That's a great question. We have time for like one more question, and Ricky asks, do you have any tips for writing LGBTQ books, and what inspired you to write your books the way you write them? Any tips?
I'll say I can only speak from my experience, but I had a very hard time, setting out to write this book at first, because whenever you're writing about, marginalized communities, you whether you want to or not, you take on a very kind of incredible burden of history and of experience. And to me, the breakthrough, and this would be my advice, is when I realized that I did not have to encapsulate every single gay male experience in this story, let alone every queer experience. It really just kind of freed me up to tell the story that I wanted to tell. So my suggestion would be, anytime you're writing about the queer community, obviously, one does not want to be deliberately offensive, but operate under the guise that someone is going to find displeasure in what you've written, or say that you didn't capture their experience, which I think is great, because this means there's plenty of room for other novels. So I would kind of try and come out from that shadow and that burden of responsibility as best you can, and focus on telling the story that you want to tell in the best way possible, and leave the rest of it is again kind of out of your control.
I think that's a beautiful answer, and I would add to that only that your characters don't have to be model citizens. I think humans are flawed, and characters who are interesting have interesting flaws. And I think, when I first saw the question, I thought, oh, well, the tips for writing an LGBTQ book would be the same as the tips for writing a book, like that, how do you think about structure and where are you thinking about your characters? But actually hearing Zak's answer, I do think that part of wanting to write from your experience about your community is also needing to divorce yourself from constantly performing the best qualities of your community for an outside eye. Like write the flaws, and it's okay. You're not, it's not a betrayal. It's simply good literature.
I would also argue that I think happy people in art are kind of boring. Like, I don't want to watch films or read novels or go to plays about people who, have their lives together. That's no fun.
Oh man, I had the visual there for just a moment of you in sweatpants and on a Saturday night and watching a rom-com and you switching the channel. So yeah, that was great, Zak. We ended the session with a great question because of the way that you guys answered it. I mean, it sort of wrapped it all up, and that was come as you are, right? Come as you are. So I want to thank you both. It's been a quick conversation. I still have like 6 pages of questions. No, I'm just kidding. That we'll have to take up another time. I want to thank the audience for their questions and for participating. And with that, enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you so much. This was a real pleasure.
A pleasure. Thank
Likewise.
you for having us.